ladies and gentlemen, distinguished listeners. Today, we stand at the crossroads of global power politics, economic uncertainty, and shifting alliances. The topic before us, India and China mend ties amid Trump tariff threats. It's not just a story of two neighboring nations attempting to reconcile after years of rivalry, but also a reflection of how one man's policies in Washington, former U.S. President Donald Trump, have sent ripples across the global economy and forced Asia's two giants to rethink their strategies. For decades, India and China have been painted as competitors to civilizations turned modern nation-states, racing for regional dominance. Yet, when the U.S. imposes tariffs that threaten the very foundations of international trade, suddenly adversaries can become collaborators, rivals may become reluctant allies, and the global chessboard is rearranged. To understand why India and China are reconsidering their relationship, we must first look at the disruptive trade policies under Donald Trump. Trump launched what came to be known as the tariff wars, massive tariffs on Chinese goods, aggressive threats to penalize countries that benefited from trade imbalances, and constant talk of bringing manufacturing back to America. While initially targeted at China, these policies also rattled India, which faced tariff hikes on steel, aluminum, and even key agricultural exports. Suddenly, the world realized that global trade was no longer predictable. The World Trade Organization's rules were being challenged. Countries that had long enjoyed the stability of open markets now faced uncertainty. In this environment, India and China began to see value in reducing hostilities between themselves. Let us be clear, India and China are not natural allies. They have a long history of border disputes, particularly along the Himalayan frontier, culminating in clashes as recent as 2020 in Ladakh. Economically, they are competitors. Then he is seeking to replace China as the world's manufacturing hub, and China looking to expand its dominance through the Belt and Road Initiative. Yet, geopolitics often forces enemies to find common ground. When Trump's tariffs created turbulence in global trade, both India and China realized that continued confrontation between them would only benefit others, particularly the U.S. and even Europe. Cooperation, even if limited, became a way to safeguard their economies. Trade is the lifeline of diplomacy. China is already India's largest trading partner, with bilateral trade surpassing $115 billion annually. Despite political tensions, Indian markets are flooded with Chinese smartphones, electronics, solar panels, and machinery. Similarly, Chinese industries rely on raw materials and pharmaceuticals from India. The Trump tariffs effectively made Chinese exports to the U.S. more expensive, pushing Beijing to seek alternate markets. India, with its massive consumer base of 1.4 billion people, became an attractive option. Conversely, India saw that alienating China completely could hurt its own industries. Thus, trade became the unexpected bridge, pulling the two closer. When Donald Trump's administration announced sweeping tariffs on Chinese goods, the shockwaves rippled far beyond Beijing. China, which relied heavily on exports to the United States, suddenly faced the possibility of a prolonged trade war that could slow its economic engine. At the same time, India observed these developments with a mix of caution and opportunity. On one hand, Washington had been steadily cultivating New Delhi as a counterweight to Beijing, and India had welcomed closer defense and technology ties with the United States. On the other hand, Trump's aggressive tariff policies raised concerns about the unpredictability of U.S. commitments. For Indian policymakers, this unpredictability revealed a potential vulnerability: overdependence on American goodwill in a climate where economic nationalism was gaining ground. This is where the India-China dialogue gained renewed significance. Though historic rivalries and border disputes continued to foster mistrust, both countries recognized that limited cooperation could serve their interests under shifting global conditions. For China, reaching out to India helped soften the blow of U.S. tariffs by securing alternative regional partnerships and ensuring its Belt and Road Initiative was not entirely isolated. For India, Engagement with Beijing provided a way to hedge against over-reliance on Washington while signaling to the U.S. that Delhi had options beyond a purely Western alignment. This was not a reconciliation rooted in shared values, but in pragmatic calculations. For instance, trade talks between India and China explored areas where mutual benefit was possible, such as agricultural imports, pharmaceutical supplies, and technology sharing. Infrastructure discussions also gained attention, particularly regarding cross-border connectivity and energy cooperation, even if India remained wary of China's strategic ambitions. Particularly in South Asia and the Indian Ocean, a cooperative stance in certain sectors could provide immediate economic relief and political leverage. Another factor that influenced rapprochement was the global perception of Trump's America First strategy. Many countries, including India, saw that the U.S. could impose economic pressure even on its closest partners, if it suited domestic politics. By contrast, China, despite its assertiveness, was presenting itself as a champion of globalization and multilateralism, hosting forums that promoted trade cooperation. India, therefore, sought to balance its ties, making sure it was not left isolated if U.S. trade tensions escalated into broader economic fragmentation. Perhaps most importantly, this tentative India-China thaw revealed a lesson in modern geopolitics. Alignments are fluid, and rivalries can bend under external pressure. The tariffs acted as a catalyst, reminding both nations that while competition defined their history, circumstances sometimes demanded collaboration. For Beijing, this was a survival strategy in the face of U.S. trade aggression. For New Delhi, it was a message to Washington that India's strategic autonomy remained intact and that no single power could dictate its choices. In essence, the tariff wars reshaped regional dynamics by showing that U.S. actions could inadvertently push adversaries into dialogue. This phase of India-China engagement, though fragile, was a reflection of how great power rivalries often produce unexpected partnerships. While geopolitics often highlights military standoffs and diplomatic tensions, the deeper truth is that economics has quietly bound India and China together in ways that cannot be ignored, despite their rivalry. Bilateral trade between the two countries has consistently crossed hundreds of billions of dollars annually, making China one of India's largest trading partners. Even during periods of political hostilities such as after the border clashes and Lada trade flows never completely stopped. This reality underscores a vital lesson. Economic interdependence acts as both a stabilizer and a bargaining chip in modern diplomacy. Trump's tariff policies accelerated this interdependence dynamic. As Chinese exporters sought to diversify away from reliance on the American market, India became an increasingly attractive destination. From consumer electronics and machinery to essential raw materials like active pharmaceutical ingredients, APIs, India's dependence on Chinese goods also meant that cutting ties outright was impractical. Instead, policymakers in both capitals began to explore how they could reduce vulnerabilities without completely severing links. For India, this meant promoting Atmanirbhar, the drive for self-reliance, but still maintaining Chinese supply lines where alternatives were not readily available. For China, it meant offering India more favorable trade terms to prevent New Delhi from aligning too closely with Washington. Another aspect of this interdependence is infrastructure and investment. Chinese companies, despite restrictions in certain sensitive sectors, have invested heavily in India's startup ecosystem, technology firms, and renewable energy projects. This dual reality of strategic rivalry on one hand and economic entanglement on the other creates a paradox. Both sides criticize and caution against overdependence. Yet neither can completely disentangle without incurring significant costs. Thus, the Trump-era tariff shock reinforced the understanding that economics often compels nations to keep dialogue open, even when politics pushes them apart. Moreover, the tariff threats highlighted the risks of unilateralism in global trade. India watched carefully as the United States targeted not only China, but also other trade partners like the European Union, Canada, and Mexico. This unpredictability made it clear that no nation, however close to Washington, was immune from protectionist measures. In this environment, India saw value in keeping its economic options open, and engaging with China was part of that calculation. At the same time, China recognized that India was not just another large market, but also a potential geopolitical swing state in Asia. Securing India's cooperation, or at least preventing its outright opposition, is crucial for Beijing as it faced mounting pressure from Washington. Even symbolic gestures, like high-level summits, joint declarations on trade, or discussions on regional stability, were important in projecting an image of resilience against U.S. pressure. Still, its economic interdependence comes with limits. Strategic mistrust remains deeply embedded. India worries about its ballooning trade deficit with China and the risks of overexposure to Chinese capital. China, on the other hand, remains cautious of India's participation in U.S.-led initiatives like the Quad. Thus, the rapprochement during the Trump tariff episode was not a full partnership, but a temporary adjustment shaped by necessity. In conclusion, economics created both opportunities and constraints in the India-China relationship during this period. While rivalry dominated the headlines, the quiet reality of interdependence ensured that dialogue never ceased. This balance between cooperation and competition is what defines 21st century Asian geopolitics, where no relationship is purely antagonistic and no partnership is without hidden friction. The very image of India and China mending ties sends a strong message globally. For the U.S., it signals that aggressive trade wars may backfire, pushing rivals together instead of keeping them apart. For smaller nations in Asia, it demonstrates that regional cooperation can counter external pressure. And for China, it reinforces the idea that no matter how much Washington tries to isolate Beijing, there will always be willing partners, sometimes even traditional rivals. Of course, let us not be naive. The India-China relationship is fraught with challenges. The border issue remains unresolved. India's distrust of China's close ties with Pakistan is deeply entrenched, and New Delhi's desire to maintain strong defense relations with the U.S. cannot be ignored. Yet, when viewed through the prism of Trump's tariffs, the immediate need for economic survival outweighed these long-term rivalries. Both sides learned to compartmentalize, agreeing to disagree on security matters while expanding trade and dialogue in other areas. So where does this leave us? If India and China continue to mend ties, even cautiously, the global balance of power could shift. Washington may find itself facing a more united Asia. Europe may pivot further towards trade with Asia rather than relying solely on the U.S., and the global economy may slowly transition away from dollar dominance. As Asian powers experiment with local currency trade, for India, this could mean faster economic growth, access to cheaper technology, and a stronger role in regional diplomacy. For China, it offers a much-needed partner at a time when the West is increasingly skeptical of Beijing's ambitions. Ladies and gentlemen, the lesson from today's topic is clear. Global politics is not static. Friendships and rivalries are not permanent. What we are witnessing with India and China is a pragmatic realignment, driven not by love or trust, but by necessity. Trump's tariffs may have been aimed at protecting American industry, but in practice, they triggered unexpected shifts, creating opportunities for India and China to soften hostilities. This shows us the interconnected nature of our world. One decision in Washington can reshape relationships thousands of miles away in New Delhi and Beijing. The challenge for India and China will be whether they can sustain this pragmatic cooperation once the immediate threat of tariffs fades. Will they deepen trust, or will old rivalries reemerge? Only time will tell. But for now, the world must acknowledge that even the fiercest rivals can become partners when pushed by external forces. Thank you.